This is a CNA podcast.
That's the sound of about 500,000 cubic meters of earth collapsing. Soil and rock, on the move and unstoppable. It's the sound that in the early hours of the 16th of December 2022 buried 31 campers on a hillside near Malaysia's Genting Highlands.
At around 2 to 3 like that, I'm not very sure, but it's at night when we were sleeping. That's the first time we heard a loud noise. Very loud, and our family is awakened by it.
But hearing the sound, understanding what it means, and being able to do anything about it are all different things, as Leong Kim Meng discovered.
Once we awake, we want to find out what's wrong. But before we can do anything, I felt my tent shaking, the loud noise. Then I try to get up. Before I can, my leg is trapped already by the mud.
Kim Meng was lucky. A friend helped to free his leg and they both escaped to safety as the landslide rumbled on. Ling Zishen also survived, but needed more help.
I
saw my lower body was buried by the soil. I tried to dig the soil with my hands, but because only my left hand was easy to move, I couldn't dig much. After a long time, the rescue team arrived. They used a shovel to dig out the soil. I was carried out, but I was slipping in and out of consciousness.
I'm Steve Lai, and on this episode of CNA Correspondent, you'll hear how this landslide tragedy unfolded for 92 campers on the grounds of an organic farm. A farm that didn't have a license to operate as a campsite. And joining me with all the details and insight are my colleagues Afifah Ariffin and Pamella Lim, who mobilized to the scene along with their cameraman. Welcome to you both.
Good morning, Steve.
Morning, Steve. Thanks.
Now, Afifah, the team was scheduled to cover the signing of an agreement by the coalitions and parties in Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim's unity government that day, but had to quickly switch gears to deploy to Batang Kali for this breaking news assignment. Talk us through that.
Well, Steve, that was the plan for that Friday. We were supposed to be at the Prime Minister's office at around 3 p.m. in the afternoon because that was when the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between all political parties were going to take place. So in my head, on that Friday morning, I would have the morning free and then I'd only start work in the afternoon. But news of the landslide broke about as early as 3 a.m. on Friday morning, and the local media reports started pushing out articles as early as 6, 7 a.m. So by morning, I woke up to the flurry of messages and calls from my editors, from Pam. Everyone was trying to reach me. And then when I woke up, I had to go through all the developments, all the breaking news that was happening, and that's when we swung into action. So we immediately did a live cross at about 11 a.m. from home just to give our viewers an update about what exactly was happening at Batang Kali, a bit more context into landslides, usually happening in the area during this time, the death toll and the people who were involved. And immediately after that, Pam picked me up with my crew and we went straight to the landslide area.
Yeah, it was a mad rush to get there as well, so we could get information from the ground. Pam, tell us what happened when you arrived at the site. I understand that access to the landslide location was actually quite limited.
Yeah, that's right. So even before we made our way there, I had to plan out the logistics. We heard there were already road closures and security was pretty tight leading up to the campsite. The good thing is the Fire and Rescue Department had already set up the ops center just outside the site. We reached the site by noon, and at the base, we couldn't really see the landslide itself, but we could already see that the search and rescue was at its height, and we heard that survivors were being brought out. So it was more trying to wrap our head around what actually happened.
And the reason why you had to keep such a distance, I presume, you can fill me in, but the site itself was still an unstable situation as it was still unfolding.
Yeah, that's right. They did not rule out more landslides, actually, because they were still checking on soil movement and stability of the ground.
And Afifah, give us some background then on this situation. Who were these campers and why were they there?
Well, it's the year-end holidays, it's a school holiday period. So this is a time when families would bring the children out to enjoy some outdoor activity. At Father's Organic Farm, there are lots of activities for not just campers, but people who wanted to enjoy a bit of nature in that area. There are a lot of ecotourism spots in Batang Kali, which is near Genting Highlands. On that night, there were about 92 people who were there, and they were various groups of people, including a group of teachers and students from Munchong Primary School in Kuala Lumpur. They made up the bulk of the victims who had died from this tragedy. Of the 31 victims, 11 of them were from the school. I think in total, there are about over 20 of them just from that group. But there were also other groups of people, friends and family members who were celebrating. From a story I've heard is one of the victims, a 7-year-old boy. It was his birthday and he wanted his entire family to be there to celebrate by going camping. So just a mix of people who were just there to have a good time and be on holiday.
It seems quite heartbreaking to have your whole family there with you for such a tragic event to happen. Just quickly, what's the age range of the people that were involved in this? As young as 7?
I think the youngest victim was a baby. I think it was 1 year old, was it, Pam? That was the youngest victim. But we also know there were babies who were a few months old. The oldest was about maybe in the late 50s, early 60s. From young to old, it's really generations of family members together.
Yeah, and it really paints a picture that it was thought to be a safe family outing to go on during a school holiday. Pam, from the accounts of the survivors that you spoke to, tell us a bit about how it unfolded for them. Given that this happened at 2 a.m. in the morning, were they all asleep?
Yeah, most of the survivors we spoke to, they were all asleep. And as you heard earlier from the soundbite, they woke up to a loud sound, what they described as an explosion. Because it was the middle of the night, it was also very dark. Visibility was poor. They could not see. They didn't know what happened. But the survivors who woke up in a shock. And when they came out of the tent, all they saw was just soil, mud all around. And those who could escape decided to run for their lives.
It must have been absolutely frightening to do that in the dark, not knowing which way was the safe way to escape to. Afifah, tell us about some of the accounts that you heard.
Well, like what Pam said, a lot of them were sleeping. But one thing that really struck me from what the survivors were telling us is that it was really fast. There were 2 waves of landslide, and the duration between the first and second landslide was about 10 minutes. But they did say that when the first landslide struck, it was just a matter of 10 to 15 seconds before the soil or the ground would reach them. And you have to understand that the entire campsite is about more than almost 2 kilometers long, from the top of the landslide right to the end of when the landslide stopped. So you could just calculate how fast the ground was moving if it could move a distance of 2 kilometers in a matter of 10-15 seconds. There was barely any time for the campers to react at that point in time. And even when they thought it was over, after the first wave was done and they were trying to free themselves out from the mud, a second wave hit. And I think that's when a lot of them who were trying to save other people decided that they couldn't. They had to run to safety first.
Yeah, that seems like quite a difficult choice to have to make when you know that there are people in danger, but as well there is danger from the second landslide coming at you as well. Pam, give us some context then. How common are landslides like this in Malaysia? Is it rare for there to be a loss of life from these events?
Yeah, so landslides are pretty common in Malaysia given our weather that sometimes sees heavy rainfall for days, which affects the hilly terrain, be it along roads like this at Batang Kali that lead up to hilltop resorts or even at residential areas. For context, in 2022 alone, apart from Batang Kali landslide, there were more than 20 other landslides reported, but only 3 to 4 of these involved fatalities or even injuries. So in terms of landslide casualties, the number is usually relatively low because either it happened at an unoccupied area or the residents or people were evacuated in time when authorities detected soil movement or cracks on the ground. There, of course, have been major ones over the decades, but this Batang Kali landslide with its 31 fatalities is the worst Malaysia has seen in almost 30 years. The only landslide deadlier than this one was the Highland Towers in 1993, where a residential block collapsed. 41 people lost their lives then.
Next on CNA correspondent Afifah and Pamella will talk you through the challenges rescuers faced as the tumbling rock and earth turned to sticky mud, and the implications for the organic farm that operated the campsite without a license.
Hi, my name is Julie Yu, and I'm the host of the Climate Conversations. Each week, I speak to guests who give us tips on how we can protect the Earth. Every once in a while, we also have interesting stories, like how Singapore's first Tesla owner prompted billionaire Elon Musk to reach out to Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, or a chef who makes the juiciest burgers from only plant-based ingredients. For more stories like these, look for the Climate Conversations on our CNA and Me Listen apps or wherever you get your podcasts.
You're back with me, Steve Lai, along with our CNA team in Malaysia, Afifah, Ariffin and Pamella Lim, as we turn your attention to the recovery efforts at the site of the Batang Kali landslide. Here's the account of one of the first responders who was on the scene about an hour after it occurred.
When we arrived, we saw the entire campsite covered in soil. Only a few sites were safe. When it was still dark, the ground was still hard. It hadn't softened. So rescuers were able to enter deeper into the campsite to save victims. But by morning, water had begun seeping into the ground, which made it wet and muddy and shifted a lot of the soil. It was very hard for us to move and to identify where the victims could be buried.
Afifah, that paints a vivid picture of what rescuers were up against, searching in the dark for survivors with conditions that just got worse.
Right, so when we spoke to some of the rescuers about what happened on that night, a lot of them told us that when they first received the emergency call saying that there was a landslide involving about 100 people at Batang Kali, many of them were shocked. They couldn't believe that there were 100 people involved in that area because they said there were no buildings in that area and they didn't expect that the number of people affected would be that large. When they got there, of course, it was completely dark. There were only maybe a couple of street lights and a couple of torch lights that were being used by the survivors who managed to dig their way out to safety. But they said it was really a race against time. When they got there, it was completely dark. It was chaotic. All they could hear were people shouting for their help to bring them to safety. But then they were also dealing with other issues like the uncertainty of whether there was going to be another landslide that could happen at that time. And because it was dark, they had to move really fast. They told me it was only when the sun rose that they could see the site, and then it only dawned on them just how large an area it was and how much soil they would have to deal with. So their priority when they got there was to get the people who were alive out of the site as soon as possible. And once everyone was brought out to safety, then they focused on searching for the remaining victims who could be buried under the soil.
And that process of rescuing those that were stuck and looking for those that hadn't been found then dragged out for several days, this rescue operation. Pam, at what point did it become clear that it was moving from becoming a search for survivors to perhaps a search for bodies?
To be honest, Steve, throughout the 9 days, at no point was it mentioned that rescuers had given up on finding survivors. But on hindsight, and according to experts we spoke to later, chances of survival past the first 24 hours were little to none. This was because given the impact of the soil, the amount of soil that directly hit tents, and also the magnitude of it, where soil had piled up more than 10 meters high. So rescuers and experts say that for landslide that involved solid structures, there could have been air pockets. There would have been chance for survival, but with just soil and wet soil at that, it was a matter of hoping for a miracle.
I think the rescuers knew of the very slim to no chance of survival past the first 24 hours, like what Pam said. But a lot of them still kept hope. They kept looking for the victims, looking for the bodies, and just sort of praying that there would be a miracle that would happen, that they would be able to find someone buried but still alive.
Sadly, though, that was not to be the case. What did it feel like when the last body that was missing was found?
From the rescuers' perspective, when we spoke to them, a lot of them felt this sense of relief. that they managed to complete their mission successfully, and that they were able to sort of find all of the bodies of the victims and bring it back to their families so that their families and those who survived would have a sense of closure. I think for everyone involved in this mission, whether it's the rescuers or whether it's the survivors and their families or even us members of the media, it was just this huge sense of relief that the last victim has been found and things have come to a close.
And Afifah, the organic farm where this happened didn't have a license. What's going to happen to them, and what are the wider implications?
I think there were a lot of uncertainties surrounding what sort of permits and licenses were needed for a campsite to operate. There's still a lot of confusion. Speaking to other campsite owners, some of them told me that they're not sure exactly what to apply for, whether there's a specific camping permit or whether it is an accommodation permit. So there's still a lot of confusion around there. But of course, these campsite operators and a couple of avid campers that I spoke to say that there should be better guidelines or more firm regulations to allow this industry to be better regulated so that people who go for camping will know what to do in an event like this. So we know that the Selangor state government has been quick to reach out to stakeholders and have discussions to come up with some sort of regulations for the industry. An investigation, of course, is still going on about what actually caused this landslide at Batang Kali. The authorities have not released the results of the investigation just yet, so we cannot speculate anything at this point. But we also know that the Selangor government is continuing discussions with the campsites, with the survivors as well, and we're expecting something to come out sometime after Chinese New Year.
And Pam, some time has passed since this landslide took place. What's your sense of how this story has played out in Malaysia and how people have reacted to it?
I think it's really hit close to a lot of Malaysians. The stories itself, seeing how many families were involved, how many children were involved. There's also a sense of being cautious. Camping and ecotourism is quite popular in Malaysia. And this site, that area, Batang Kali being just about 10, 15 kilometers from Genting Highlands, it sort of make people more cautious to especially venture in these areas during the rainy season. But at the same time, everyone is also waiting for this investigation report to know what exactly caused this, because we know that the night where the landslide happened, it wasn't a rainy night. Previously, people thought landslides happen during heavy rainfall or after several days of rainfall. So there's a lot of uncertainty and people just want to know the results of the investigation. And what precautions should they take if they were to go camping or go outdoors?
And hopefully we'll get those answers in due course, and we will for sure be covering it on CNA across our different platforms, so our listeners will be able to keep an eye out for that one. Just one last quick question for both of you, actually. Afifah, perhaps you can go first. What's your biggest takeaway from covering this story that our listeners may not have picked up?
I think it's a sense of, when the tragedy struck, just how the entire nation came together to give their support and to grieve with the families. We know that the rescue efforts involved all the agencies, whether it's the health ministry, the roadworks department, the environment ministry, all the rescue agencies, your fire and rescue department, civil defense, your police, everyone just came together. And when we spoke to the rescuers, you get a sense that people didn't care which agency they came from. Their task was to just save as many lives as possible. So they all told me that they worked very cohesively as one search and rescue unit. We also saw a lot of people trying to give as much and contribute as much to the search and rescue efforts as possible. We had a lot of NGOs coming to give donations, to give food to the people at the site. Some of them, even when there was too much food, they even decided to give dog food for the canines who were involved in the rescue mission. And the outpouring of grief, it's the whole country that was grieving together. When I was outside Munchong Primary School, people had left flowers as a tribute to some of the teachers who had died in the incident. But a lot of the other people who came to put flowers there weren't even people from the school. They told me that they had just heard of the story in the news and decided to come and pay their respects and tribute. So that was very heartwarming to see just really how everyone came together to support one another in this tragedy. But another thing I think that our viewers didn't get to see as much as we did being on the ground was the sheer scale of the landslide. When we first got to the base that was set up by the Fire and Rescue Department, it was outside, so we didn't quite have a view of the ground zero or the area the landslide struck. But when we hiked up about 2 kilometers right to the top of the hill, that was when we could see just how vast it was, just how much soil had moved from an elevation of about 100 meters. When we stood there, we realized that this was massive. It was just not a normal landslide. It was really, really big.
From those on the site, like Afifah said, whether it was rescuers or journalists, it's often assumed that we have to detach from our emotions when on duty. But in times like this, it's just not possible. When we spoke to the rescuers, almost every one of them said how heartbreaking it was for them to be hearing the news of families involved, for them to be bringing out children and entire family who lost their lives. While they had to manage their emotions, thinking of their loved ones back home, it was also motivation for them to soldier on despite the fatigue. Some of them worked throughout the 9 days with 2 to 3 hours of rest in between. Their motivation was to at least be able to give the family some closure. And for us, while we reported the hard facts and the death toll as just a number, but each and every victim has a story, has a family, and these survivors and these families shared their pain and grief with us. And I think that's something that will stick with us for a long time.
Yeah, and I understand as well that you're putting together a special program all about this as well.
Yeah, so we're doing a whole episode for CNA Correspondent on the Batang Kali landslide. So this is where we will get to listen from the victims, from the rescuers, about what happened and what unfolded on that fateful night. And we'll also look at the regulations surrounding camping. What's going to be happen? How can the authorities assure people that this is a safe activity for everyone to enjoy?
Keep an eye out for that one on the CNA TV, the CNA Correspondent TV version. In the meantime, Afifah and Pamella, the presence of you and your cameraman on the ground was crucial to our coverage of this tragic story as we covered it across all our platforms. Thank you for that and for speaking to me today.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Steve.
Natural disasters are often accompanied by tragedy and are always difficult to cover. Unpredictable in nature and with stakes at the highest level of life and death. Time is of the essence. Quick thinking and the right resources are needed in an often unknown and unpredictable environment. You hope for the best, but must be ready for the worst. The TV version, CNA Correspondent, airs on CNA every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. You can also watch it whenever and wherever you like on cna.asia. Do like and subscribe to this podcast version that takes you behind the scenes with our correspondents so you don't miss a single episode. Our podcast team is made up of Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, and me, Steve Lai. Thank you for listening.
Did you miss your deadline to renew your Medicaid coverage? You can still send your completed annual review form to Healthy Connections Medicaid. You may be assigned to another health plan, but you can ask to come back to First Choice within 60 days of renewed Medicaid eligibility. It's your family. It's your choice. First Choice is the right choice. Renew and choose us. Visit selecthealthofsc.com/renew to learn more.